Hello everyone, today we have as a guest Dr. Daniel Feldmann,
Hello?
and he recently wrote a book about Model, the German general, and so we asked a few questions, and what came up for me is basically I always read and heard that Model was Hitler's fireman, so that he basically held up the defense if the front was broken or something. Now, over the last few years, I got a bit hesitant because a lot of stuff I read over the years turned out to be lightly incorrect, completely incorrect, or other hogwash. So, how much of this model being Hitler's fireman is actually valid? What came up in your research?
Yeah, but this is very interesting. There are a few things to say about Model being the fireman. First, we need to look into his career a little bit more closely to see where this perception comes from. It's very interesting also to have a look at how this word fireman was set to Model's name in the post-war literature, and then what is a fireman about. So let's have a look at his career. This is going to explain where it comes from. Model reaches the army command level early 1942. He commands the 9th Army. This is an army position 150 kilometers west of Moscow in a very dire situation. I'm not going to go in right now into his career in 1942 and 1943 because the nickname Fireman relates to the situation in 1944. At that point, Model moves up to Army Group Command, and in a period of less than 9 months, he is going to hold four positions as Army Group in 4 different Army groups. So it starts in January 1944. He is called to take over Army Group North in Russia. What happens at that point is the Russians are counter-attacking from Leningrad, and they broke through the German lines. The general in charge, von Küchler, is sacked, and Model takes over. Then, in April, less than 3 months later actually, Model is called to take over Army Group South, which is then renamed Army Group North Ukraine, and he replaces Manstein. Manstein is sacked and goes to retirement and will never get another field command again, and his successor is Model. And again, the situation is dire. There's a whole Panzer army surrounded by the Russian when Model gets there. And then 2 months later, in June 1944, he's called to take over Army Group Center. And this is 5 or 6 days after the beginning of a big Russian summer offensive in Belarus, Operation Bagration. So the whole front has been smashed through by the Russian, and the Field Marshal in charge, Bush, is sacked. Model takes over. And again, 2 months later, in August, I think it's on the 18th or 19th August, Model is called to take over command of the Western Front, replacing Kluge. And then he takes the whole Western theater, is Oberwest. And this is again a situation where the Americans have just broken through the Normandy bridgehead and are in full exploitation through France. They haven't reached Paris yet. And this is the point where Model is nominated as head of Oberwest. So when you look at these 4 situations in 1944, indeed, this guy is called after some kind of catastrophe has just happened. That's true. And that's where you can say he is sent as a fireman. It has a ground in reality. Now, 2 extra questions about that. One, I like to understand how history is made. So, strangely enough, this nickname Fireman does not appear in any contemporary record, and it is not ever mentioned in the immediate post-war record. That is, in the literature of the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, whenever model is mentioned, he's a secondary character in this literature because he committed suicide in April 1945. He didn't leave any notes of his campaigns, contrary to Rommel. He didn't write his memoirs, contrary to Guderian or Manstein, anyway, etc. But anyway, whenever he appears in the literature, he's not called Fireman. For example, even in the very popular book by Paul Carrel, Hitler Moves East and Scorched Earth, which are extremely problematic, full of anecdotes, full of made-up stories. Well, no, he's called then a defensive strategist, whatever that means, a great firm stander, whatever that means, but not a fireman. It's only in his very first biography in 1975 by a long-forgotten writer called Görlitz, that there is this mention. The chapter there about Model in 1944 is called At the Burning Point, an den Brennpunkten. And then in the 80s, well, everybody seems to say, well, this guy has been the fireman of Hitler. It becomes the common nickname. So this is a very late nickname, actually. But it has a ground in reality. And however, what is even more interesting is, could he extinguish any fire? So it's great to be called as a fireman, and that was his situation. But then, did he actually kill the fire or not? Or did it keep burning? Did it keep burning? And what I realized is in each of these situations, Model actually kept on suffering defeats. The first case, you remember, was in the North, Army Group North. He gets the job end of January 1944, and he actually retreats about 150 kilometers until the former border of the Baltic states, where there is some kind of a stop line called the Panzer line. And that's exactly what the guy before him had asked for. The guy before him said, vonKickass said, we should retreat to that line. Hitler said no, sends Model, and Model after 6 to 8 weeks, has retreated to that line. More or less the same. If you consider the next situation, Army Group South, so when he takes over, a whole Panzer army is surrounded. However, Manstein has defined a plan to save this army before being fired. And what Model does, he's just running this plan, implementing the idea from Manstein. And this idea is pretty much for the surrounded army to break through the Russian lines. If you are at the army group level, there's little you can do except, break through. So it's more like the guys in charge in this Panzer army made the job rather than the boss at the army group. He doesn't try to send a rescue mission. And then if you consider the situation during Bagration, so when he takes over, the Russians have already made some strong breakthrough. They are about, I think, something like 100 kilometers from Minsk now, a little less than that. And what happens is, Model is going to again retreat until Poland, until the Vistula River, until the suburbs of Warsaw. So he's moving west 500 kilometers. And at that point, the Russian army, after making such headway, is kind of exhausted. So did he extinguish the fire? No. And again, if you consider the situation in France, so he takes over about June 18th or 19th, something like that. The Americans are still 50 to 100 kilometers west of Paris. And they get in Paris on the 24th, and they cross the Seine River, etc. So again, he's going to step back more than 200 kilometers, pretty much until the German border and the Dutch border, the Belgium-Dutch border. So could he extinguish any fire? Fact is, no. So he was a fireman. He tried to do things, but was that an effective fireman? Well, in this situation, no.
So in kind of way, it seems more like Hitler trusted him with consolidating the front after a major breakthrough by the enemy happened, more or less, and he was basically trusted that he didn't retreat until necessary. Would that probably be the best description?
Well, the fact that Hitler trusted him certainly is bound in reality. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been sent to such successive position. And he was never blamed for the retreat. This is also something very striking about Model, and we can talk about that more later. Now, it's not obvious whether it was his action or whether it was the, let's say, kind of automatic or natural exhaustion of an army after making such a raise that eventually stopped the Allied advance. What I mean is, in World War II, usually an army which moves on 200 to 300 kilometers has to stop because of logistics, especially when the defending side is careful about destroying all the railroads while retreating. So an army that moves forward 200 to 300 kilometers, more or less, has to stop, rebuild the railways, and then can try to move again. Now, as we move in the war, this length of advance moves up a little bit from 300 to sometimes 500 kilometers. But there's a point where the advancing army, the logistic of the advancing army, is the key factor in stopping. Now, if you consider the situation of Model, if you want to know whether it was Model action that stopped the enemy or whether it was inevitable logistics constraints that stopped the enemy, well, the best thing is to look at what happened in areas of the front where Model wasn't in charge. And if you consider Russia, or let's say the East Front in summer 1944, well, Model was in charge of Army Group Center. He was nominally in charge of Army Group North Ukraine, but he couldn't manage both army groups, actually. The Russians also stopped advancing against Army Group North. They reached the Baltic Sea at some point. They cut off Army Group North from Army Group Center at some point. This is in August 1944. But then the Germans could counterattack and resume the link between both army groups. The point is, this counterattack took place after Model left the front. So, and then if you look at the south of the front, in Romania, etc., well, the Russians also eventually stopped, and Model wasn't there. If you consider the Western Front in August 1944, Model was both Oberwest, in charge of the whole theater, and head of Army Group B. He held two positions. Army Group B was the army group fighting north of France against the Normandy landing. Having these two positions was too much for one person, and Model never really cared about what happened in South France, where there was another army group, and there was, as you know, a secondary Allied landing in Provence, in South France, mid-August. That was 3 or 4 days before Model took over. Then this army in South France moved up the Rhone River very quickly. Model was really fighting against the one from Normandy, and the fact is both the armies from Normandy and the armies from South France kind of stopped progressing early or mid-September. And this stop from the armies in the south were against German defenders, which were not commanded by Model anymore. So, was it because of Model, or was it because mechanically at some point an advancing army of the World War II type must stop because of logistics and other constraints? Had it been a situation where only the troops in front of Model had stopped, but not the others, it would have been definitely the Model.
So it seems mostly like a trust issue of Hitler towards his other channels or something, or towards Model, in which way you want to put it.
Yeah, But also, Model had some skills as a defensive general, definitely. But in my opinion, they showed more in other situations than trying to plug holes after a breakthrough. When you look at his career, in 1942, so he was head of 9th Army in the...
This was at the Reshef salient, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So there was a bulge of salient of about 100 kilometers deep and 100 kilometers wide, something like that. And this could have been a springboard to attack Moscow again. So the Russians really wanted to get rid of the Germans there. And in 1942, they attacked several times the Germans. They especially they attacked during summer. They made a very strong offensive that completely failed, didn't take any territory. And they resumed attacking at the end of the year, again with massive forces, and failed again. And this second defensive victory has been really uncovered by Colonel Glantz 20 years ago. It's Operation Mars. It's not that known because it took place exactly at the same time as the very successful Russian offensive against Stalingrad. So they tried both. The Soviet army was strong enough to try both a big attack in the north and a big attack in the south. The one in the north completely failed, and the one in the south was a great success. But if you go back to Model, the fact is he was in command during the two big offensives that I just mentioned, the one in summer in August and the one a bit later in the year. And he managed very well to use his forces extremely efficiently to stop and to frustrate the Russian assault, with huge casualties to the Russians and almost no gain in territory. We're talking about a few kilometers here and there, which is nothing at this scale. So definitively he could do that, and he did that very well. And one key thing is he was fighting on prepared position. In spring 42, he had time to fortify the perimeter and organize static defenses. And then, yes, the Russians didn't break through. And you can also find another situation a bit similar, and strangely enough, not that known, in autumn 1944 in the Western Front. So, as this is well known, Operation Market Garden, which is the attempt by the Montgomery's army group to get to cross the Rhine, going through the Netherlands. Well, who is defending against that? It's Model. Model is the German general in charge of the defense, and he does manage, with bits and pieces of almost no unit, it does manage to frustrate this attack. Moreover, he is also in charge of the defense of Aachen sector in Germany. So this is against the US army, and the US army is attacking in this area in October and November 1944. They eventually manage to capture Aachen, but they also try again to break through, to reach the Rhineland plains. And especially, they launch a very big offensive, which I think has been largely forgotten, called Operation Queen. And this is in November 1944. There's a massive air support organized by Bradley, and Hodges is launching the attack. And this makes no headway. It doesn't go through. And who is defending? Well, Model is defending. And again, this is defense on prepared position. He had time to fortify. And he manages to hold this front, even though the US attacked with a large superiority of strength.
So that is very interesting, because if I remember correctly from what I read, Hitler specifically said he needs people that hold the line, Steher, which basically means people that stand. And it seems like then the contemporary name that Hitler gave to Model is way more valid than the Fireman, because he was once he was dug in, or he could dig in and hold the position, and really defend. But the fireman, after the fire started, it was too late. Interestingly enough, I should add here that a few years ago, I actually found in a German manual that they specifically referred to units or the use of units as fire brigades, as Feuerwehr. So, and I was surprised, and I sent this to a few historians, and they were also surprised, because we always heard of, these units were used as fire brigade, but this was actually written in a manual. So it's interesting that there's actually something in a written form, that this is not a colloquial just, but also that it made it into I will send you the link later, or the source. So in that sense, the term for fireman for a model seems to be wrong.
Well, fireman, or let's say ineffective fireman. He was the guy sent in desperate situation, but he could not extinguish fires. Contrary to what you read here and there.
Thank you very much for your time. And by the way, Daniel's book is available, sadly so far only in French. So if you speak French, it should not be a problem. But if you don't, well, we will have a few more videos. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching, and see you next time.